The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as the first rays of September sunlight pierced through the ancient stone walls. Inside the castle's private apartments, a silence deeper than any protocol could command had settled over rooms that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Queen Elizabeth II, the longest-reigning British monarch, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at Balmoral Castle in Scotland just days before, but today marked the beginning of her final journey home to Windsor, where she would rest beside her beloved husband, Prince Philip. In a courtyard below, members of the household division moved with precision born of decades of training. Every step had been rehearsed countless times, every detail planned and replanned until it became second nature. Yet nothing could have truly prepared them for this moment. The woman they were preparing to honor had been more than their sovereign. She had been the constant around which their entire world revolved. Colonel James Morrison stood at attention near the castle's main entrance, his uniform pristine despite the early hour. He had served the Queen for over 30 years, had been present at countless state occasions, had seen her weather crisis after crisis with the same calm dignity. But today felt different. Today, the weight of history pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. The Queen's body would arrive from Scotland aboard the royal train, a journey she had taken hundreds of times during her reign, but never before as a passenger unable to wave to the crowds that would undoubtedly gather at every station along the route. The royal train had departed Edinburgh the previous evening, carrying its precious cargo through the Scottish Highlands, past the industrial cities of the Midlands, and down through the rolling countryside of southern England. At every level crossing, every platform, every bridge that offered a view of the tracks, people had gathered. They came with flowers, with flags, with photographs of the Queen taken over 7 decades of public service. Some had traveled hundreds of miles just to stand in silence as the train passed. Others had simply stepped out of their homes when they heard the distinctive sound of the royal locomotive approaching. Inside Windsor Castle, the Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Young, reviewed the arrangements one final time. Every detail had been coordinated with military precision, yet he knew that no amount of planning could account for the human element, the raw emotion that would accompany this day. The Queen had always been a stickler for protocol, but she had also understood that the monarchy's greatest strength lay in its ability to connect with ordinary people during extraordinary moments. The castle staff moved through their morning routines with unusual quiet. Many had served the Queen for decades, had seen her children grow up, had witnessed the transformation of the monarchy under her steady guidance. Mrs. Patricia Williams, who had served as a palace housekeeper for over 20 years, found herself pausing in the Queen's former study, where reading glasses still sat on the desk beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. The human touches in these grand rooms had always surprised visitors. The family photographs, the well-worn books, the comfortable chairs that spoke of a woman who valued substance over showmanship. In the town of Windsor, shopkeepers were beginning to open their doors to streets already filling with people. They came from every corner of the United Kingdom and beyond, drawn by a shared sense that they needed to be present for this historic moment. Many carried camping chairs and thermoses prepared for a long wait. Others clutched flowers or small Union Jack flags. All seemed to understand intuitively that this was not just about saying goodbye to a queen, but about marking the end of an era that had defined their lives and the lives of their parents and grandparents. The local police had estimated that perhaps a few thousand people might gather to watch the arrival of the hearse. By dawn, it was clear that their estimates had been conservative by orders of magnitude. Superintendent Sarah Collins found herself coordinating crowd control for numbers that exceeded anything in her 25-year career. Yet remarkably, the crowds were self-policing, organizing themselves in neat lines, helping elderly visitors find places to sit, sharing umbrellas and snacks with strangers who had become temporary companions in grief. Back at the castle, the Queen's 4 children, now King Charles III, Princess and Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward, had arrived to await their mother's return home. Each carried their own memories of this place, their own understanding of what the monarchy had cost and given their family. Charles, in particular, felt the weight of transition pressing upon him. For 73 years, he had been heir to the throne. Now, suddenly, he was king, and his mother, his guide, his teacher, his North Star, was no longer there to offer advice or comfort. Princess, and known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, had insisted on accompanying her mother's coffin on the journey from Scotland. She had ridden in the car behind the hearse, watching as thousands of people lined the route, many in tears, others simply standing in respectful silence. The sight had moved her more than she had expected. Her mother had always spoken about the importance of being seen to be believed, and, even in death, she was drawing people together in a way that few could have imagined. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, arrived at the castle as the morning progressed. He had the heavy responsibility of leading the nation in prayer during the coming days. But first, he would offer private comfort to the royal family. The Queen's faith had been central to her life and reign, a source of strength that had sustained her through personal tragedies and national crises. The Archbishop remembered their last conversation, just weeks before her death, when she had spoken about her hope that the monarchy would continue to serve as a unifying force for the nation. In the castle's kitchens, staff prepared for the arrival of dignitaries, family members, and officials who would gather throughout the day. But there was an awareness that normal protocols were suspended. This was not a state occasion in the traditional sense. It was something more personal, more profound. The Queen had always drawn a careful distinction between the public role she performed and the private person she was, but today those boundaries seemed to blur. Outside the castle walls, the crowds continued to grow. Television crews from around the world had set up their equipment, but they found themselves covering something that defied easy categorization. This was not just a news event. It was a moment of collective mourning, of shared memory, of national reflection. Reporters who had covered royal events for decades found themselves struggling to capture the unique atmosphere of respectful grief mixed with genuine affection. Among the crowds, conversations sprang up between strangers. People shared memories of where they were when the Queen's death was announced, how the news had affected them, what her reign had meant to their families. An elderly man named George Fletcher, who had served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands War, found himself talking to a young mother who had brought her toddler daughter so she can say she was here. These conversations, replicated thousands of times throughout the day, created an invisible web of connection that seemed to embody everything the Queen had represented. As the morning wore on, reports began to filter in about the royal train's progress through the English countryside. At every stop, railway workers stood at attention on the platforms. Signal boxes displayed messages of condolence. Even the landscape seemed to participate in the solemnity of the occasion, with the autumn colors of the trees providing a natural cathedral through which the Queen was making her final journey. The precision of the arrangements was matched by the spontaneity of public response. No one had ordered these displays of respect. They emerged organically from a population that felt a genuine connection to their departed monarch. The Queen had always understood that the monarchy's survival depended not on the grandeur of its ceremonies, but on the consent and affection of the people. Today, that understanding was being validated in the most powerful way possible. Local businesses along the route had closed their doors, with many displaying handmade signs expressing condolence and respect. The economic cost was significant, but it seemed irrelevant compared to the historical importance of the moment. This was about more than commerce or normal daily routines. It was about participating in a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. As the hearse carrying the Queen's coffin finally appeared on the horizon, moving slowly along the long walk toward Windsor Castle, the massive crowd fell into a silence so complete that the sound of horses' hooves could be heard clearly across the entire gathering. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The return of their Queen to her final resting place, the beginning of the last chapter in a story that had captivated the world for 7 decades. The state hearse moved through the crowds like a ship cutting through still water, its glass sides revealing the oak coffin within, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown. The sight was both magnificent and heartbreaking, a final glimpse of the woman who had been a constant presence in the lives of millions for over 70 years. As the vehicle progressed slowly along the long walk, the silence was broken only by the soft sound of weeping from the thousands who had gathered to witness this historic moment. Inside the hearse, The queen's coffin rested on a purple velvet-covered platform, surrounded by white flowers chosen from her own gardens at Balmoral. The arrangement was simple yet profound. Lilies, roses, and greenery that spoke of her love for the natural world and her connection to the Scottish estate where she had spent her final days. These were not the elaborate state flowers that might have been expected, but personal touches that revealed the private woman behind the public crown. The procession moved at exactly 2.5 miles per hour, a pace that allowed every person lining the route to have a clear view while maintaining the solemnity appropriate to the occasion. Members of the King's Guard flanked the hearse, their red tunics and bearskin caps creating a moving frame of tradition and honor. These soldiers had sworn an oath to serve the crown, but today they were serving something larger. They were guardians of history itself, ensuring that the Queen's final journey was conducted with the dignity she had maintained throughout her life. Behind the hearse, cars carried the royal family, their faces composed, but clearly showing the strain of public grief. King Charles III sat in the leading vehicle, his expression grave as he watched his mother make her final public appearance. Beside him, Queen Camilla offered quiet support, understanding that this day marked not just personal loss, but the weight of new responsibility settling on her husband's shoulders. The transition from prince to king had been instantaneous upon the Queen's death, but the emotional reality was still sinking in. In the crowds, people held up their mobile phones to capture the moment, but many found themselves lowering their devices as the hearse passed, preferring to experience this historic moment directly rather than through a screen. The instinct to document was overwhelmed by the need to simply witness, to be present for something that felt larger than any individual experience. Mary Thompson, a retired teacher from Yorkshire, had traveled over 200 miles to be present for this moment. She clutched a photograph of herself meeting the Queen during a school visit 30 years earlier, tears streaming down her face as she remembered the monarch's genuine interest in her classroom and her students. She asked about every child by name, Mary whispered to the stranger standing beside her. She cared about the details, the real things that mattered to ordinary people. The weight of royal protocol had governed every aspect of the Queen's public life, but today those same protocols served to honor her memory and provide structure for a nation's grief. Every element of the procession had been planned with meticulous attention to detail, from the precise positioning of the horses to the timing of each segment of the route. Yet beneath the formal arrangements, genuine emotion pulsed through every moment. As the hearse approached the castle gates, the crowds pressed closer, though police barriers maintained respectful distances. The atmosphere was unlike anything seen before. Part state occasion, part funeral, part celebration of life. People of all ages, backgrounds, and beliefs stood united in their respect for the woman who had devoted her life to serving them. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly veterans saluted, and ordinary citizens simply stood in quiet acknowledgement of the end of an era. The castle itself seemed to participate in the solemnity of the occasion. The ancient stones, which had witnessed over 1,000 years of royal history, provided a backdrop that connected this moment to centuries of tradition. Windsor Castle had been home to 40 monarchs, but none had occupied it for as long or with such dedication as Elizabeth II. Every room held memories of her presence. Every corridor echoed with her footsteps. Every window had framed her view of the world she served so faithfully. Inside the castle walls, staff members who had served the Queen for decades stood at attention, their emotions barely contained. Butler Paul Morrison, who had served afternoon tea to the Queen countless times, found himself remembering her particular preferences: Earl Grey tea, cucumber sandwiches with the crust removed, and always a moment to ask about his family. The Queen's ability to remember personal details about the hundreds of people who worked for her had been legendary among the staff, a reflection of her genuine care for the individuals who made her public duties possible. The precision of the military arrangements was matched by the spontaneous tributes that appeared throughout the day. Flowers began accumulating at designated points around the castle, growing into vast carpets of color that spoke to the deep affection felt by the public. Each bouquet told a story. A child's drawing thanked the Queen for her service. A veteran's wreath honored her role as head of the armed forces. A simple bunch of garden flowers from an elderly couple expressed gratitude for a lifetime of dedication. As the hearse finally reached the castle's main entrance, a guard of honor formed by members of the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, presented arms in perfect unison. The sound of their movements, the precise click of heels, the synchronized shoulder of arms, created a rhythm that seemed to echo through the centuries of military tradition the Queen had embodied throughout her reign. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward, his vestments catching the afternoon light as he prepared to offer prayers for the departed monarch. The words he would speak had been carefully chosen, but everyone present understood that no language could adequately capture the significance of this moment. The Queen had been more than a constitutional figurehead. She had been a symbol of stability, continuity, and service that had transcended political divisions and personal differences. Television cameras captured every moment for broadcast around the world, but the true significance of the day could only be understood by those physically present. The sight of thousands of people united in respectful grief, the sound of absolute silence broken only by the clip of horses' hooves, the weight of history being made in real time. These elements combined to create something that transcended normal experience. The hearse came to a gentle stop, and the coffin bearers stepped forward with measured precision. These men, selected from the Queen's own regiments, had rehearsed this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared them for the emotional weight of actually lifting their sovereign's coffin. Each step was taken with careful deliberation, each movement coordinated to ensure that the Queen's final journey was completed with the same attention to detail that had characterized her entire reign. As the coffin was carefully transferred from the hearse to the shoulders of the bearer party, the crowds remained in absolute silence, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred. The oak coffin, crafted with the same care that had gone into every aspect of the Queen's public life, bore the weight of 7 decades of service, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to duty. The moment seemed suspended in time, as if the entire nation was holding its breath. Here was the woman who had promised on her 21st birthday to serve her people for her whole life, and she had kept that promise until her final day. The coffin represented not just the end of a life, but the conclusion of a covenant between monarch and people that had defined a modern British identity. Inside the castle, family members waited to receive their mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother for the final time. The personal and public aspects of the Queen's life, so carefully balanced throughout her reign, were converging in this moment of profound transition. The woman who had been mother to 4, grandmother to 8, and great-grandmother to 12 was also the head of state who had worked with 15 different prime ministers and met with presidents, dictators, and world leaders from every corner of the globe. As the bearer party began their slow march toward the castle entrance, each step seemed to echo through history itself, marking the end of the longest reign in British history and the beginning of a new chapter for the monarchy and the nation. The bearer party moved with synchronized precision through the castle's ancient gates, their steps echoing off stone walls that had witnessed nearly a millennium of royal ceremonies. 8 soldiers from the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, carried the coffin with reverent care, their faces set in expressions of solemn concentration. Each man had been selected not just for his military bearing, but for his personal dedication to the crown. Today, they carried the weight of history on their shoulders, understanding that their actions would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. The castle's interior had been transformed for this momentous occasion. Centuries-old tapestries provided a backdrop of royal heritage, while carefully placed flowers added touches of natural beauty to the formal setting. The Queen had always believed that the monarchy should reflect both the grandeur of tradition and the simple beauty of everyday life, and today's arrangements honored both aspects of her philosophy. Family members gathered in the private apartments, each dealing with grief in their own way. The Queen's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren represented 4 generations shaped by her influence. Prince William, now heir to the throne, found himself reflecting on the lessons his grandmother had taught him about duty, service, and the delicate balance between public responsibility and private life. The weight of future kingship, once a distant concept, now felt immediate and real. Princess Catherine stood beside her husband, providing quiet support while managing her own emotions. She had been welcomed into the royal family with warmth by the Queen, who had seen in her daughter-in-law the same dedication to duty that had characterized her own approach to royal life. Their final conversation, just weeks before the Queen's death, had focused not on protocol or procedures, but on the importance of raising children who understood both privilege and responsibility. The Queen's great-grandchildren, including Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, were present but struggled to fully comprehend the magnitude of the moment. To them, Gon had been the family matriarch who always had time for stories, who taught them about the horses in the royal mews, and who showed genuine interest in their school projects and childhood adventures. The formal ceremonies were impressive, but secondary to their memories of a loving great-grandmother. Outside the castle, the crowds remained remarkably patient despite the hours of waiting. The British capacity for orderly queuing had become legendary, but today's gathering transcended mere politeness. People shared food, offered chairs to strangers, and engaged in conversations that bridged generational and social divides. The shared experience of witnessing history created temporary communities among people who might never meet again. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian who had traveled from Cambridge specifically to witness this moment, found herself in conversation with factory worker James Peterson from Sheffield. Their different backgrounds melted away as they shared memories of the Queen's various appearances over the decades. She came to our factory in 1977 for the Silver Jubilee, James recalled, talked to everyone on the production line, remembered details about our processes when she came back 5 years later. That's the kind of person she was. The media coverage was unprecedented in its scope and scale. Television networks from around the world had positioned crews at strategic locations, understanding that this was more than a British story. It was a global moment. The Queen had been one of the most recognizable faces on Earth, a symbol of stability and continuity that transcended national boundaries. Her death marked the end of an era not just for Britain, but for the entire post-war world order she had helped to navigate and shape. Inside the castle's St. George's Chapel, final preparations were being made for the private family service that would follow the public ceremonies. This Gothic masterpiece, where the Queen had worshipped regularly, and where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had been married in 2018, would host the most intimate moments of the day. The Queen's faith had been central to her life, providing both personal comfort and public guidance throughout her 70-year reign. The Dean of Windsor, the Right Reverend David Connor, reviewed the service one final time. The Queen had been closely involved in planning her own funeral arrangements, understanding that every detail would carry symbolic weight. The music, readings, and prayers had been chosen to reflect both her personal beliefs and her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The service would be traditional, but personal, formal, but heartfelt. Members of the royal household staff who had served the Queen for decades gathered in the castle's corridors, many struggling to control their emotions. These men and women had seen the Queen in countless situations, during times of crisis and celebration, in moments of public triumph and private sorrow. Their grief was both professional and deeply personal, rooted in decades of daily interaction with a woman they had come to love as well as respect. Angela Thompson, who had served as one of the Queen's personal dressers for over 20 years, remembered the monarch's unfailing courtesy and consideration. She always said please and thank you, Angela whispered to her colleague. Never took anyone's service for granted, always remembered birthdays and family situations. She was extraordinary in the most ordinary ways. The international presence at the castle was remarkable in both its scope and its genuine character. Presidents, prime ministers, and heads of state from around the world had requested to pay their respects, but space limitations meant that only the most essential dignitaries could be accommodated. The Queen's relationships with world leaders had been built over decades of careful diplomacy, personal chemistry, and mutual respect that transcended political differences. President Emmanuel Macron of France, who had developed a particularly warm relationship with the Queen, found himself remembering their last meeting at Windsor Castle. She had spoken fluent French throughout their conversation, demonstrating the linguistic skills that had served her so well in international relations. Her death represented the loss of a unique diplomatic asset, someone who had personally known and worked with leaders spanning 7 decades of global politics. The Commonwealth representatives present understood that they were witnessing a particularly significant moment. The Queen had been head of the Commonwealth throughout her reign, transforming an empire into a voluntary association of nations united by shared values rather than colonial history. Her death would trigger constitutional changes across multiple countries and reshape relationships that had been personally managed by her for generations. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the castle's ancient windows, creating patterns of light and shadow on the stone floors, the weight of transition became increasingly apparent. The Queen's death had been expected for some time due to her age, but the reality was still jarring. Institutions that had operated under her authority for decades now had to adjust to new leadership, new relationships, and new ways of conducting business. The royal standard that had flown over the castle during the Queen's residence had been replaced by the royal standard of the new king, symbolizing the immediate nature of monarchical succession. But symbolic changes were easier to implement than emotional adjustments. The personal relationships, institutional memories, and cultural connections that had defined the Queen's reign could not be transferred as easily as constitutional authority. The staff at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and the other royal residences faced an uncertain future. While the monarchy itself would continue, the personal style and preferences that had shaped their daily routines for decades had ended with the Queen's death. New patterns would emerge under King Charles III's leadership, but the transition period would require careful navigation of both practical and emotional challenges. As the afternoon progressed and the moment for the final ceremonies approached, the atmosphere inside the castle became increasingly charged with emotion. Family members, staff, and dignitaries all understood that they were participating in the conclusion of the longest reign in British history. The Queen's passing marked the end of an era that had defined not just Britain, but the entire post-war world. The coffin rested in the castle's quadrangle, surrounded by flowers and guarded by motionless sentries whose vigil would continue until the moment of burial. The sight was both majestic and poignant, a final tableau that captured the essence of constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. The Queen's public funeral ceremonies had concluded, but her private journey was not yet complete. Later that evening, in the intimate confines of the King George VI Memorial Chapel, the royal family would gather for the most personal and final farewell to their beloved matriarch. The crowds outside began their slow dispersal, but many lingered, reluctant to leave the scene of such profound historical significance. Conversations continued among strangers who had become temporary companions through shared experience. People exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch, understanding that they had been part of something that had bonded them in ways that transcended normal social boundaries. Margaret Foster, a retired nurse from Devon, found herself walking alongside Tom Bradley, a construction worker from Birmingham. They had stood next to each other for over 6 hours, sharing stories, water, and tissues as the emotions of the day overwhelmed them both. "I never thought I'd cry so hard for someone I never met," Margaret confided. Tom nodded in understanding, adding, "But we did know her, didn't we? She was always there, part of our lives, part of who we are as a country." The international delegations began their departures from Windsor, each carrying with them memories of a day that had demonstrated the unique place the British monarchy held in global affairs. The Queen's personal relationships with world leaders, built over decades of state visits, Commonwealth meetings, and diplomatic encounters, would now need to be rebuilt with her successor. The institutional memory and personal connection she had cultivated would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to replicate. President Biden of the United States, who had been among the guests at both the Westminster Abbey service and the Windsor Committal, reflected on his final meeting with the Queen just a year earlier. She had been 96 years old, but still sharp, still engaged, still demonstrating the diplomatic skills that had made her such an effective representative of British interests on the world stage. Her death marked the end of a personal relationship that had spanned multiple American presidencies and fundamental changes in the global political landscape. Inside Windsor Castle, the immediate royal family gathered in private apartments that suddenly felt vast and empty without the Queen's presence. King Charles III faced the enormous task of not just assuming constitutional duties, but of stepping into the role of family patriarch that his mother had filled for over 7 decades. The private grief was compounded by public responsibility, the personal loss made more complex by institutional obligations. Princess, and known for her practical approach to royal duties, found herself coordinating the complex logistics that would follow the public ceremonies. The Queen's personal effects needed to be sorted, her private papers reviewed, her numerous charitable patronages transitioned to other family members. The administrative details of death were complicated by the scale and scope of the Queen's public life and private interests. The royal residences, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, and Balmoral, would all require adjustments to reflect the new reign. Staff members who had devoted their careers to understanding the Queen's preferences and routines now faced the challenge of adapting to a new monarch with different tastes, different priorities, and different approaches to royal life. The Queen's beloved corgis, perhaps the most personal symbols of her private life, now needed new arrangements. These dogs had been constant companions throughout her reign, featured in countless official photographs, and served as a bridge between her public and private selves. Their care represented one of the most touching practical concerns in the aftermath of her death. The evening's private burial ceremony would take place in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, a small, intimate space within St. George's Chapel complex. Here, the Queen would finally rest beside Prince Philip, ending a separation that had lasted since his death 15 months earlier. The couple's 73-year marriage had been one of the great royal love stories, a partnership that had sustained the Queen through the challenges and triumphs of her unprecedented reign. Only close family members would attend this final ceremony, a stark contrast to the global audience that had witnessed the earlier services. This would be the moment when the Queen ceased to be a public figure and became simply a beloved mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother being laid to rest by those who had known her most intimately. The memorial chapel itself was small and simple, designed to be a place of private reflection rather than public ceremony. The Queen's parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, were already interred here, along with Princess Margaret, the Queen's only sibling. The reunion of the family would provide comfort to those who understood the Queen's deep devotion to her parents and her close relationship with her sister. As darkness fell over Windsor, the symbolism of the day's events began to resonate more deeply. The Queen's death marked not just the end of a reign, but the conclusion of a particular approach to monarchy that had evolved over 7 decades of social, technological, and political change. Her ability to adapt while maintaining essential principles had been key to the monarchy's survival and relevance in a modern world. The media analysis that would follow in the coming days and weeks would examine every aspect of the funeral arrangements, looking for clues about the future direction of the monarchy under King Charles III leadership. But those closest to the situation understood that the most important transitions would happen gradually, in private moments and personal decisions that would shape the institution over the coming years. The Commonwealth nations faced particular challenges in adjusting to the new reign. The Queen's personal relationships with prime ministers, governors general, and heads of state across the Commonwealth had been built over decades of careful cultivation. Her death would trigger constitutional procedures in multiple countries and potentially lead to renewed discussions about Republican movements in several Commonwealth realms. The British public's response to the Queen's death had surprised many observers with its depth and genuine emotion. Opinion polls had shown growing Republican sentiment in recent years, particularly among younger generations, but the reaction to her death suggested that the monarchy's emotional hold on the population remained strong, even if its future constitutional role remained subject to debate. The Queen's legacy would be measured not just in the length of her reign, but in the fundamental transformation she had overseen in the monarchy's relationship with the public. When she became queen in 1952, the monarchy was still largely mysterious, operating behind closed doors with minimal public scrutiny. By the time of her death, it had become one of the world's most visible and documented institutions, subject to constant media attention and public opinion. Her personal legacy was equally complex and significant. The Queen had been trained for a role that was already changing rapidly when she assumed it, and she had spent 7 decades adapting to new challenges while maintaining the essential dignity and service that defined constitutional monarchy at its best. Her example had influenced not just her own family, but countless individuals who had worked with her or been inspired by her dedication to duty. As the final private ceremonies concluded in the early hours of the morning, Windsor Castle settled into a new reality. The Queen was at rest, reunited with her beloved husband and family members in the quiet dignity of the memorial chapel. The public phases of mourning would continue for weeks, but the most intimate farewell had now taken place. The new reign had officially begun, bringing with it all the uncertainties and possibilities that accompany major transitions. King Charles III would need to establish his own approach to monarchy, balancing respect for his mother's legacy with the need to address contemporary challenges and changing public expectations. The story that had begun with the Queen's arrival at Windsor Castle for her final journey home had concluded with her peaceful rest among family members who had preceded her. The ceremonies had been magnificent, the public response overwhelming, and the historical significance undeniable. But in the end, the most powerful legacy was the example of a life devoted to service, duty, and unwavering commitment to the people she had sworn to serve. The Elizabethan age was over, but its influence would continue to shape British society and the global understanding of constitutional monarchy for generations to come. The Queen's final journey had ended, but the institutions and values she had championed would continue their own evolution under new leadership, carrying forward the best of her legacy while adapting to the challenges of a changing world.